One of the most powerful tools when creating a shader with procedural methods is the ability to manipulate coordinate vectors and even generate your own custom coordinate maps. Space manipulation is something we have been doing all along in this chapter, but it is still something I want to dedicate a whole video to, as there are more intricacies and fundamental ideas. Now that you have seen some of the applications, I want to explain a bit more what goes into it. This is also a good time to talk about the fundamental logic of shader node trees. The information is processed from left to right, so all the changes that you make in the nodes propagate from the left to the right as well. This is why, for example, you don't apply a transform operation after an image texture in the node tree to change its location, but rather shift the incoming coordinate vectors at its left. You can just use a vector method node to add a vector to the coordinates which shifts the texture by that vector. This general logic should make sense by now after we talked about the importance of coordinates. But what I want to really point out in this section is that what you are essentially doing is manipulating the space that the texture on the right is drawn in. That idea is very useful to understand, as it can be generalized for a broad variety of use cases. To visualize what is actually going on when you are doing such space manipulation, I made another visualization tool that should help you to better understand what I mean by that. I have the file with the tool opened up right now, and you can download it from the page with this video. I will not go into too much detail of how this tool is set up, but let me quickly go over what we are looking at. On the left, there are two viewports showing a plane and top view, and on the right is the shader node setup. The core part of this tool is the node group that is already opened up, and if I tab out of it, you can see the whole setup. The only important part here is that this part of the node tree draws this very simple shape with the RGB curve method that I already explained before. And the coordinates that this shape uses are manipulated in the essential node group called space manipulation. This node in between is just there to dial in the effect of manipulation. You can simply control this parameter with the factor property in the viewport. To see the space manipulation take effect, change the bottom viewport to rendered. That will change it into cycles rendering, while the top viewport shows you the material preview with Eevee. Right now, there is no difference between the two, because the node group just passes through the original coordinates. But you will see what happens when we manipulate the texture space in just a second. Okay, so now that you know the general setup, let's put this tool into action. Make sure that the factor slider is cranked up to 1, and tap back into the space manipulation node group. Right now it just passes through the incoming UV coordinates, but if I add a vector math node in between, you can see the texture being shifted in the top viewport just as you have seen before. But something interesting is happening in the bottom viewport. Instead of the texture being shifted, the texture itself is fixed in place and the plane is shifted in the opposite direction. This shows what is essentially happening when you are manipulating the texture space like this. The add node shifts the coordinate system that the texture is drawn in, and so a different part of the texture is drawn on the plane. The point that I want to make here is that you are actually not changing the texture itself at all, but rather manipulating the texture space that is defined on the plane. I know that this can be a tough concept to wrap your head around completely, but try to get familiar with this idea. Of course, adding is not the only operation that can be applied to manipulate the coordinate space. Just like what we have done before to create shapes and patterns, the space can be squished, stretched, warped and bent, ripped apart and put back together to create all sorts of different effects. I recommend you just play around with this idea and see what you can come up with, but I still want to go over a couple of useful ways that I personally use a lot. So, let's start with the standard methods of transformation, which are offsetting, rotating, and scaling. The way of approaching these is very straightforward. To gain access to all three transformation types, you can just use a mapping node. If you have been using shader nodes previously, then you have probably already come across this node. Maybe you have been wondering why for positive values it shifts the texture in a negative direction, or why values for the scale greater than 1 make the texture appear smaller. Well, with this visualization you can see why. What you are transforming with the node is the actual coordinate system and not the texture itself. When you change the type to texture, the exact inverse transformation is applied, making it more intuitive to work with. In a lot of cases, you don't need to use all three transformation types. You can also just supplement offsetting and scaling with a vector math node, setting it to add for offsetting and scale, or alternatively multiply for scaling. For rotation, you can just use the vector rotate node, which also has a bunch of more options than the mapping node has. Another advantage of using the transformations individually is that you can choose the order in which they are applied. Naturally, there is a difference between rotating first and then shifting along an axis and doing it the other way around. Being able to choose between those methods can simplify a lot of issues. And now that we are on the subject of the order of operations, I want to point out how crucial it can be to make the right decision in that regard. It is a frequent source of errors, as oftentimes it is not very intuitive. I hope that this video and the tool that I'm providing help you to wrap your head around the logic of these operations. Don't worry if this is giving you a hard time at first. It takes quite some getting used to this way of thinking. You will probably confuse the order of operations for a long time. Trust me, I still do it a lot. And if you are truly lost, there's no shame in just flipping the order of nodes around until it works as intended. That is one of the advantages of a node-based shading system. Now that we covered the basic transformations and talked a bit about the importance of order, let's generalize the idea of space manipulation further. Instead of modifying the coordinate space with a simple vector operation, you can also split it into its XYZ components and modify those individually. For example, just like you have seen in the previous chapter, we can apply the ping-pong operation to the X component to achieve a mirrored repetition. And now you can nicely see how it works. The coordinate system is folded and goes back and forth between x equals 0 and x equals 1. In the same way, you can of course use all the other ways of controlling values to manipulate these coordinate values. In theory, there are no limits to how the space can be manipulated. Just to prove this point, I made a Suzanne silhouette just by manipulating the texture space of this exact setup. One very simple but effective method of space manipulation that I want to mention is finally using a noise texture to drive the distortion. As I pointed out before, a color is just a vector, and so we can just use the color output of the noise texture and add it to the coordinates. This gives us a really nice distortion effect that is incredibly useful when you want to give a pattern some natural variation. The only problem right now is that the values of the noise texture are centered around 0.5. This means that the coordinates as a whole are shifted on average. To counter this effect, you can just subtract a vector of 0.5 from the noise. Then it is centered around 0, and you can also add a scale node to change the amount of this effect. Alternatively though, you can simply use a color mix node instead. Setting it to the blend mode linear light has the exact same effect. The only disadvantage is that the amount slider now is clamped between 0 and 1. Using the additional vector math nodes allows you to apply the effect without a limit. I mentioned on an earlier topic that there is a way to fake blurring in the shader nodes, even without pixel-based textures. When you crank up the scale parameter of this noise texture, you can see how this effect looks more and more like it is blurring the texture. The problem here is that the texture itself is not actually being blurred. An edge between black and white will not result in a gray tone, just in a cluster of black and white dots. You could get actual blurring by applying this effect multiple times with different seeds and mixing the results. This, however, is incredibly cost-intensive, and I recommend avoiding this workflow as much as possible. The last thing that I want to point out in this section is that all of these operations can be used together in succession. Space manipulation can be incredibly useful and vital for specific textures, but it can be an absolute pain to wrap your head around for complex setups. Luckily, that's not necessary most of the time. You can rather remember simple setups as small chunks and build more complex shaders modularly. Just remember the logic that the coordinates on the left influence the texture setup on the right as a whole. Maybe after space manipulation you are already looking forward to manipulating time. Well, we will be doing that in a later chapter of this course.